On a moss-green blanket, Dr. Aris Thorne sat quietly, her voice reading from an old book, while a tiny bobcat cub curled against her arm. For days she had returned to this very spot, a steady presence in the grass. The fragile cub had chosen her, seeking warmth and safety no cage had ever given. But they weren't alone. From the shadows of a rock ledge, the mother bobcat stepped forward, golden eyes fixed on the scene just feet away. Her cub purred softly against the stranger, while the mother's body tensed. What happens when a traumatized predator finds her baby in the arms of a human? And what she did next left everyone holding their breath. Before we begin, tap the like button, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you never miss these powerful true stories. The click of a camera shutter, so harmless for most of us, rang out like shackles snapping shut inside that rundown roadside zoo, tucked away somewhere in the shadowy corners of the Appalachian Mountains. I remember the metallic tang in the air, that stale, slightly sweet smell of animal fear mixed with the dust of old sawdust and popcorn, the kind only cheap attractions ever seem to have. Tourists huddled by the rusty cages, jostling for a good shot, their faces lit with excitement. Every time a flash went off, it was like a lightning bolt in the dark, searing through the gloom. But for the animals inside, especially Shadow, the bobcat mother, each burst of light was a wound all over again. I watched her shrink from the bars, her body nothing but bones beneath a battered coat, eyes wide with something I can only describe as haunted. She flinched at every sound, every movement, and right up against her belly, nearly hidden beneath her trembling body, was the only survivor from her litter, a tiny cub, barely old enough to open his eyes, with a splash of rusty orange fur, hence the name that would stick, Rusty. He clung to her, mewing so weakly it nearly broke my heart. That night, a storm was brewing, not just outside but inside those walls. The rain came down in sheets, pounding the metal roof and rattling the locks. Most people had gone home, but somewhere beyond the main road, a young ranger, barely out of college, was making a last round. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just the wind carrying the faint, desperate cry of a newborn bobcat through the broken window pane. Whatever it was enough. The rescue was sudden and surreal. The team moved fast, no grand heroics, just quiet urgency. They slipped through the shadows, guided by that haunting cry. When they found the cage, Shadow didn't even snarl or lash out. She simply froze, staring through the bars as if she'd already left her body behind. When the door creaked open, there was a moment, one heartbeat, when I thought she might run, might fight, but she only trembled. They reached for Rusty first. He was so small, barely more than a handful, clutching desperately to a battered milk bottle someone had tossed in the cage days ago. I saw his tiny claws gripping plastic, his wide eyes searching for warmth. The way he was lifted out, awkward, frightened, but still alive, burned into my memory. That single image, a shaking cub in the rain-soaked hands of a rescuer, would mark the beginning of everything that followed. Shadow, meanwhile, let herself be guided out, step by step, every muscle rigid, her mind somewhere between terror and hope. The team whispered gentle words, maybe more for themselves than for her. For the first time in her life, Shadow walked into the open air, with no bars between her and the world. But freedom felt just as terrifying as captivity. Even after the van doors closed, and the rain faded to a soft drumbeat, there was no sense of celebration, just relief, and a bone-deep worry about whether this broken little family could ever be stitched together again. That's how their journey began. On a night so dark, even hope seemed afraid to show its face. But hope was there. It was in the trembling paws of Rusty, in the silent courage of Shadow, and in the hands of those who refused to let them disappear behind rusted bars. And as the van rattled down the muddy road toward Havenwood Sanctuary, I realized, sometimes the most life-changing stories start not with a roar, but with a cry so soft you have to lean in close just to hear it. Havenwood Sanctuary sat at the edge of a deep, ancient forest, a place where the shadows of old oaks mingled with the golden haze of morning sun, and streams wound their way through meadows wild with lupine and fern. It was meant to be a haven, a kind of soft landing for the broken and the wild. But for Shadow, the transition from iron bars to open air was less like freedom and more like falling through empty space. The day they arrived, I watched from the wooden walkway above as the staff opened the carrier door, inviting Shadow and Rusty into a wide, semi-wild enclosure. Rocks, old stumps, thick tangles of underbrush. For a long time, Shadow wouldn't budge, so she pressed herself into the back of the crate, her eyes flicking from every human to every patch of sunlight, as if each one might be another trap. But eventually, drawn by the scent of pine and the faintest hint of safety, she slunk out, low to the ground. Rusty trailed after her, his tiny body weaving through grass still heavy with dew. Shadow didn't pause to take in her new world. Instead, she bolted for the darkest spot she could find, a shadowy hollow beneath a shelf of rock. That would become her fortress, her place of refuge. She vanished into it like a ghost. Days slipped by. The staff called it adjustment, but the truth is, Shadow simply disappeared into her cave, as if she could fold herself back into darkness. She rarely emerged during daylight. Every sound, a distant clang, a car backfiring, the metallic click of a gate, sent her scurrying deeper, her body pressed flat to the dirt, every muscle tensed. Sometimes, at dusk, I would see her yellow eyes glinting from the black, watching everything but never moving. Rusty, on the other hand, was a restless spirit. He didn't understand the invisible walls inside his mother. Sometimes he'd poke his nose into the light, chasing bugs or the drift of a falling leaf, but always, he circled back to the fortress. He'd nuzzle against Shadow, seeking warmth or comfort. But more often than not, she would shrink away, her body stiff with fear. Not rejection, not really, just a kind of panic that flared up whenever he got too close. It was as if she was afraid that love itself might shatter the fragile shell she'd built around herself. Nights were the hardest. The wild was full of new sounds. Owls hooting, coyotes yipping far away, the wind rattling through the trees. Rusty would cry out, a high, lonely sound that seemed too small for such a big world. He survived mostly on the bottle, his appetite uncertain, his little paws kneading the blanket in the nursery section of the den. I watched him sometimes through the hidden camera feeds, just a tiny ball of orange fur, shivering in the moonlight, calling for a mother who couldn't come close. The staff at Havenwood tried to help. They left food near the den, kept the area quiet, and made sure the other sanctuary animals didn't wander too near. But Shadow's world had shrunk to that patch of darkness, and Rusty's world was her, no matter how distant she remained. And still, the days inched forward. The sun rose and set. The forest changed its scent and color, but the fortress beneath the rock never budged. There were moments, fleeting but real, when Rusty would poke his head out and watch the other animals, foxes, deer, a pair of rescued raccoons, play in the grass. He seemed to want to join them, to leap or tumble, but the pull of that silent cave was stronger. He always turned back. It's a strange thing, witnessing the aftermath of survival. People talk about rescue as if it's a finish line, but really, it's just the first shaky step onto unfamiliar ground. For Shadow, the world outside the cage was vast, unpredictable, and just as dangerous as the world within. For Rusty, hope was as fragile as a moth's wing, flickering in the shadows. But inside that fortress of silence, a new chapter was waiting. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't breaking out. It's learning to let something or someone in. Elias Vance had been at Havenwood longer than most of the ancient trees. He moved through the sanctuary with a gentle certainty, his silver hair tucked under a sun-bleached ball cap, boots muddy from 1,000 early mornings. There was kindness in his hands, but also the weight of every animal he'd failed to save. With Shadow, he found himself at a loss, his bag of tricks, worn thin from years of heartbreak, couldn't seem to reach her. That's when Dr. Aris Thorne arrived, carrying her own invisible wounds. She wasn't what people expected from a veterinarian. Young, yes, but already carrying a sadness that clung to her like the smoke from old fires. Her eyes, sharp and gray as river stones, seemed to miss nothing, especially pain. Word around the sanctuary was that she'd left her career in the city after a surgery went wrong, and a beloved patient never woke up. No one asked for details. Loss here was an old companion. Aris didn't speak much her first days at Havenwood. She walked the grounds, letting the wind tangle her dark hair, her hands tucked in the pockets of her battered jacket. Some of the staff thought she was standoffish. Others recognized a kindred spirit, someone patched together by regret. But where others saw a case for protocols and schedules, Aris saw something different in Shadow. She believed true recovery couldn't be forced, not by medicine, not by confinement, not by anyone's timeline, but the animal's own. She once said, half to herself, "There's no scalpel sharp enough to cut away fear." Her approach was quiet, steady, almost invisible. It began with observation. Aris spent hours at the edge of Shadow's enclosure, just sitting, never making eye contact, barely moving except to jot something in her battered notebook. Sometimes she'd sit so still a bluebird would land nearby, peering curiously at the human who smelled like sadness and hope. She noticed the patterns, the way Shadow's pacing grew frantic when someone slammed a truck door, the way Rusty whimpered whenever he felt his mother's tension spike. There were no miracles in those first weeks, only small gestures. Food placed just a little closer each day, a blanket laid out in the sun, a gentle voice reading aloud from an old, dog-eared book. Elias watched, skeptical but willing to try anything. He'd seen experts come and go promising transformation, only to leave with the animal's scars still raw and open. Aris made no promises. She brought Rusty warm milk and placed it just within Shadow's sight, then stepped back, far enough for the bobcat to feel unthreatened. If Shadow moved toward it, Aris made no move at all. No reward, no fuss, just the steady hum of her presence. She understood that healing wasn't about fixing, it was about waiting. about showing up every single day and letting trust build like moss on stone. At night, after the sanctuary quieted and most of the staff had gone home, Aris would sometimes linger by the enclosure, her breath fogging in the cool air. Shadow never showed herself, but Rusty sometimes peeked out, his little face curious, his tail twitching. Aris would whisper softly, stories from her childhood or lines of poetry, never expecting a response, simply filling the night with gentle sound. There were setbacks, of course. A sudden thunderstorm would send Shadow spiraling back into her hollow, trembling eyes wild. Elias would worry, pacing the office, wondering if they were doing more harm than good. But Aris always returned the next day, undeterred by failure, her patience unwavering. For Rusty, the world was still new, a place of both wonder and confusion. He grew a little each day, sometimes exploring the edges of the blanket Aris left behind, sometimes hiding for hours. He was a bridge, though he didn't know it yet. The living, breathing reason his mother might one day risk stepping out of the dark. That was Aris's gift, not forcing a single moment, but believing that, given time, even the most wounded creatures might choose healing on their own terms. The world outside Shadow's fortress was full of risk, but it was also full of hands that were learning, painfully, how to offer help without demanding trust. Aris never tried to lure Shadow out with food or force her with fences. Her medicine was rhythm, something gentle, predictable, the opposite of the sudden chaos that had haunted the Bobcat's every step. Each morning, rain or shine, she laid a moss-green blanket not far from the rock ledge where Shadow hid, sat cross-legged with a battered old paperback, and began to read aloud. She didn't choose animal stories or fairy tales. Her favorites were books about wild places, the kind with quiet passages about rivers and roots, and the sound of wind in the pines. Her voice was steady, low, a gentle cadence that drifted across the clearing, softer than the babble of the sanctuary's creek. To anyone passing by, it might have looked odd. A woman reading aloud to the woods, a book cradled in her lap, not a soul in sight. But to Shadow and Rusty, it became an anchor, something reliable in a world that had never given them that before. At first, nothing changed. Shadow stayed hidden in her cave, ears flicking at every page turn or distant shout from the staff. But there was something about the routine, the way Aris showed up every day, never rushing, never raising her voice, that slowly began to loosen the knots of fear. The birds grew used to her. Even the squirrels grew bold, darting close for crumbs. Rusty, ever the explorer, was the first to crack. He'd creep to the very edge of Shadow's hiding place, nose quivering as he watched Aris. Some mornings he darted back in at the sound of a squirrel's chatter. But more and more often, he lingered, drawn by the human's calm, almost hypnotic tone. One chilly morning, as Aris read about mountain rivers tumbling over ancient stones, Rusty took his first real step toward her. He crouched low, belly to the grass, eyes wide and shining. Shadow watched from the shadows, every muscle taut, but she didn't stop him. Inch by inch, the little cub made his way to the edge of the blanket, nose twitching, heart pounding so loudly you could almost hear it in the hush. Aris pretended not to notice. She kept reading, letting her words fill the space between fear and curiosity. It took nearly an hour before Rusty dared to curl up at the far corner of the blanket. The look on his face, equal parts exhaustion and awe, was something I'll never forget. For a long time he just lay there, eyes half closed, lulled by the rhythm of her voice and the soft warmth of the morning sun. Days turned into a new kind of pattern. Rusty would appear each morning, creeping closer, until at last he felt bold enough to nuzzle against Aris's arm. She would pause, let him settle, then resume reading, her voice and his breathing blending with the hush of the stream, with the wind in the pines. It was a quiet transformation, one that unfolded not in grand gestures but in small, steady moments. The unpredictable noises of the world, metal clangs, distant shouting, were still there, but they grew dimmer against the gentle background of story and song. The clearing felt different now, softer, as if it belonged just a little more to hope than to fear. Shadow stayed at the edge of it all, never venturing close to, but I saw a change in her eyes. She didn't flinch every time Rusty left her side. She watched him, wary but no longer frantic. She began to listen, not just for danger, but for the steady, healing music of a voice that asked nothing but presence. The first bridge had been built, almost without anyone noticing. It wasn't made of stone or steel, but of patience, of days strung together like beads, of the soft merging of human and animal hearts. If you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the fragile beginnings of trust, humming just beneath the surface. In the cool quiet of early dawn, before the other animals stirred, and before the sun reached into the corners of Havenwood, Shadow would lie awake inside her hollow. The world outside was changing, and she could feel it. The press of grass against her sides, the subtle hush that followed Aris's footsteps, the gentle pulse of stories floating through the air. But her body still held the memory of cages, and trust was something that came only in whispers, if at all. From her fortress beneath the rock, Shadow watched everything. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her golden eyes glinting from the shadows, fixed on the spot where Rusty now curled at Aris's setpa. The sight of her cub, so small and defenseless, nestled against the human, was a tangle of emotions she could barely process. There was the urge to run and snatch him back, to hide him from all the world. But there was also something else, something old and buried, a longing for safety, for peace. Each day, the patterns repeated. Aris would come, blanket in hand, book under her arm. She never tried to tempt Shadow out, never even looked directly at her den. She simply made herself part of the landscape, steady, quiet, unthreatening. Shadow could hear every turn of a page, every soft exhale as Aris read. She listened not with hope, but with the wary patience of an animal who'd learned the world rarely offers gentleness without a catch. And yet, slowly, the evidence mounted. Rusty, always bold, grew more at ease with Aris. He would tumble off the blanket, chase a stray leaf, then dart back and collapse in a heap beside her. Sometimes he'd nuzzle against Aris's hand, or fall asleep tucked into the crook of her arm, his tiny breath rising and falling in time with her stories. There was never a flash of anger, never a shout, never the sharp crack of a cage door, only the steady music of a voice that carried no threat. But for Shadow, the old wounds ran deep. At night, when the sanctuary fell still, she'd remember the way chains clanged and flashes burned her eyes, and she'd curl herself tighter around the past. Even in sleep, she kept one ear cocked for danger, one eye cracked open to watch the world. One morning something changed. Aris had left a toy, a knotted rope, rubbed with the scent of fresh catnip, at the edge of the clearing. It was nothing more than a gesture, an offering left in peace. Rusty found it first, batting it clumsily, then rolling in the grass with kittenish abandon. Shadow watched, heart pounding, as her cub squealed in delight. The urge to intervene rose up, thick and hot. But instead of pulling Rusty away, Shadow stayed hidden, trembling, eyes glued to every move. A squirrel darted through the underbrush, and for a second Rusty startled, his body tense, his eyes searching for his mother. That was the moment Shadow nearly broke cover. Her whole body tensed, claws digging into the earth. But then she heard Aris's calm voice, soft, steady, reassuring, and watched as Rusty relaxed, reassured by the presence of his new human friend. The past and present collided inside her chest, each memory clashing with the one unfolding before her. Instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that she needed to shield her cub from every unknown, but something softer whispered that maybe, just maybe, things could be different here. In the hush that followed, Shadow let herself listen, not just to the threats, but to the gentle sounds of peace, the steady turn of book pages, the quiet purr of her son's breath, the pulse of a new world daring her to believe. For the first time, she didn't retreat deeper into the dark. She stayed, frozen and watching, heart pounding, not with terror, but with the desperate hope that what she was seeing might, for once, be real. The first storm of summer came without warning, a wall of black clouds rolling in across the hills, swallowing the sun. At Havenwood, the animals sensed it before the humans did. The deer vanished into the woods, the foxes curled up under fallen logs, even the air felt heavy, charged with something electric and old. That evening, Aris arrived early, drawn by the strange quiet in the sanctuary. The sky was bruised and restless. She brought her blanket and her book, hoping the ritual would bring calm. But as she stepped into the clearing, the first rumble of thunder made the ground vibrate beneath her boots. Rusty, who'd been chasing a beetle through the grass, froze mid-pounce. His ears flattened. The clouds above thickened, the wind whipping through the trees with wild fingers. A second crack of thunder split the air, and Rusty bolted for the blanket, his tiny body trembling all over. Aris reacted without thinking. She scooped Rusty up, wrapping the blanket tight around his shivering form, pressing him against her chest. Her heartbeat was steady, her voice gentle as she whispered into his fur. Nonsense words, soothing and soft. A lullaby for the lost. Rusty buried his head into her jacket, eyes squeezed shut, trying to disappear into the warmth and safety he'd found there. The rain came in sheets, drumming hard on the leaves, the smell of wet earth filling the air. Lightning forked across the sky, so close that the flash illuminated even the deepest shadows of Shadow's fortress. Shadow watched, muscles rigid, her golden eyes wide with terror and longing. Then it happened. A bolt of lightning struck a pine tree at the edge of the enclosure, splintering wood and sending a shower of dirt and needles flying. The crack was deafening. Rusty let out a sharp, panicked cry. For a heartbeat, everything froze. And then, from the depths of her fortress, Shadow let out a low, ragged cry, a sound caught somewhere between fear and pain. It wasn't anger that drove her out, not this time. It was something primal and impossible to ignore, the desperate need to protect her child. She stepped out into the downpour, body sleek and wild, every muscle tensed. She crossed the clearing in a flash, her gaze never leaving Rusty and Aris. Her eyes, once wild with suspicion, now burned with desperate concern. Aris looked up, meeting Shadow's stare across the space between them. She didn't move. She just knelt there, The blanket held tight around Rusty, letting the rain soak her through. For a long, suspended moment, human and Bobcat faced each other, both trembling, both afraid, but not of each other. Shadow's breath came in heavy pants, her chest rising and falling as she weighed the scene. The thunder rolled away, fading into the distance. In that strange hush that follows a storm, Aris slowly extended her arms, unwrapping the blanket just enough for Shadow to see her cub's face. There was no aggression in Shadow's posture now, just fierce, motherly fear. She patted closer, water streaming off her fur, her gaze flicking between Aris and Rusty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached out and gently brushed her nose against Rusty's head. The cub stirred, nuzzling weakly at his mother's familiar scent. For the first time since arriving at Havenwood, Shadow stood not in hiding, but in the open, the rain painting her in streaks of silver and gold. She watched Aris, still wary but not retreating, her body a living bridge between fear and trust. As the last drops of rain fell, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath. In that brief, quiet moment, a new thread was woven, a fragile trust, born not of comfort, but of facing the storm together. The morning after the storm, Havenwood glistened, everything washed clean, the world heavy with the scent of new earth and pine needles. Aris came back early, boots squelching in the mud, her jacket still damp from the night before. She coughed a little, voice rough, but her eyes carried the determined warmth of someone who refuses to let the past win. Shadow, too, was changed. She had not returned to the deepest part of her hollow. Instead, she lingered at the edge, fur still spiked from the rain, watching the world wake up around her. It was the first time I'd seen her out in the open after sunrise. Her body tense, but her eyes softer, less like amber glass and more like the gold of autumn leaves. Aris laid the moss-green blanket as always, but today she set down a bowl of warm broth, rich with rabbit and herbs, just within sight of the rock ledge. She kept her movements slow, careful. Shadow watched, her nostrils flaring as the scent drifted over. There was hesitation, a step forward, a retreat, another step. But hunger and something deeper finally won out. For the first time, Shadow crept out from her hiding place while Aris was still in the clearing. Her body was low, cautious, every muscle ready to spring away. But she made it to the bowl, pausing only once to fix Aris with a long, searching look. Aris didn't flinch. She simply lowered her gaze, a subtle gesture of respect. Shadow began to eat, quick at first, then slower as she realized there was no danger here. The transformation was slow, never a straight line, always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But each day after that, Shadow came out a little sooner, stayed a little longer. When Aris spoke, her voice was softer, her words more like a song than speech. She would tell stories of wild places, memories of loss and healing, her own regrets folded quietly into tales of second chances. The animals in the sanctuary listened, even if they didn't understand the words. One crisp morning, as fog still clung to the low grass, Rusty napped beside Aris, curled tight with the innocence only the very young possess. Shadow approached, slow and hesitant, eyes flicking from Aris to her cub and back. She circled once, twice, then, with a sudden resolve, bent down and licked Rusty's fur, her tongue rough, her touch awkward, but achingly tender. Aris froze, heart pounding, barely daring to breathe. She knew how fragile this moment was, how easy it would be to break the spell. But Shadow didn't flee. She lingered, her head bowed, her body sheltering Rusty as he blinked awake and pressed himself closer to her chest. There was a weight in the air, a kind of hush that made the clearing feel sacred. It was as if something ancient and wounded had begun to heal, the broken threads of mother and cub weaving together, not in secrecy but in the quiet presence of a human who had learned to wait. That day, Aris packed up her things a little more slowly, glancing back as she left the clearing. She saw Shadow watching her, not with fear but with a cautious curiosity, the kind that says, "I'm not ready yet, but I see you." And for the first time, I let myself believe this family could become whole again. The walls Shadow had built weren't gone, not yet. But now, for the first time, there was a door in them, a door left ever so slightly ajar, letting in the smallest sliver of light. By midsummer, the rhythm of Havenwood had settled into something almost peaceful. The trauma wasn't gone, but it was softer now, woven into the backdrop of birdsong and the rush of the little stream behind the sanctuary. The staff learned to walk gently around the rock ledge, to speak quietly when they came near. Everyone knew a fragile line was being walked. One wrong move and the old fear might flood back in. But there were signs of healing everywhere. Shadow was no longer just a ghost in the shadows. She'd begun to emerge during daylight, even when Aris or Elias passed nearby. Sometimes she would sit atop her rock, soaking in the sun, eyes half closed as Rusty played in the grass. More than once she was seen swatting playfully at his tail, teaching him how to pounce and leap, skills he would one day need if he ever returned to the wild. Aris, always present but never intrusive, became a fixture in this new life. Her calm presence was like an anchor in the clearing. She made herself small, always sitting low, never reaching out to touch, letting trust come at its own pace. Sometimes she'd toss a scrap of rabbit toward Shadow, but mostly, she just watched, learning the language of bobcats. The slow blink, the subtle tail flick, the way Shadow flattened her ears when nervous and raised them when curious. Then came a day when the fragile peace was tested. A sanctuary volunteer, new and unaware of the routines, accidentally dropped a metal bucket just outside the enclosure. The crash shattered the calm, ringing out like a gunshot. Rusty yelped, spinning in a panic and bolting straight for his mother. Shadow froze. Her body went rigid, muscles trembling, every instinct screaming at her to flee back into the dark. But something was different now. Instead of running, Shadow stood her ground, legs quivering but firm. For a long moment, she just breathed, fast and shallow, but steady. Her golden eyes flicked to Aris, who remained perfectly still, her hands open, her body language quiet and unthreatening. Aris caught Shadow's gaze and simply nodded, slow and gentle, signaling that everything was okay. It was a silent conversation, one built over weeks of patience and shared space. Shadow exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and turned to Rusty, licking the top of his head. The message was clear. The world is loud, but you are safe. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no music, no applause, but in the language of wild things, it was everything. Trust didn't need words. It lived in glances, in the decision to stay instead of flee, in the space where fear used to be. From that day, a new kind of understanding bloomed in the clearing. Shadow began to teach Rusty more confidently, showing him how to stalk, how to crouch, how to listen for the faintest sound. Sometimes she let him wander farther, always keeping him in sight, but letting him taste the edges of independence. Aris became part of this ritual too, a silent participant in the slow dance of learning and letting go. Even Elias, ever the skeptic, noticed the change. "It's not about taming," he told Aris one evening, watching the bobcats play. "It's about teaching them the world isn't just something to survive. Sometimes it's something you can trust." For Shadow, trust had never been a given. It was a choice made new each day. And for Rusty, it became the air he breathed, something he'd carry with him, whether his life stayed in Havenwood or led him back to the wild beyond the fence. Summer deepened, bringing with it days of honeyed sunlight and warm breezes, the air sweet with clover and the hum of bees. The world outside the sanctuary seemed distant, but inside Havenwood, questions began to stir. No one wanted to ask outright, but everyone wondered. What would become of Shadow and Rusty? Were they ready for the wild, or would the memory of cages follow them forever? Elias and Aris walked the fence line one golden evening, the bobcats playing in the shadows nearby. Elias, always pragmatic, spoke first. "We've done good here, but are we just building a prettier cage?" Aris was quiet for a long moment. She watched Shadow as the bobcat led Rusty through a thicket of ferns, teaching him how to move without sound. "We saved her from iron bars," Aris finally said, her voice low. "But letting her go now, into a world full of sudden noises and bright flashes, would be sending her back into a different kind of prison. Every thunderclap, every camera flash, would be a chain she couldn't escape." Elias nodded. He'd seen it before. Animals set free only to return, wounded by a world that did not understand their scars. "So, what do we do? Are we enough?" Aris's gaze softened. "True freedom isn't just open space. It's feeling safe in your own skin. Shadow's learned to trust here, maybe for the first time in her life. We can't erase her past, but we can give her a future that's not just survival. Here, she can choose when to hide and when to step into the light." It wasn't an easy decision. The staff debated, weighing the ethics, the hopes, and the hard realities. Some argued for gradual rewilding, others for permanent sanctuary. In the end, it was Shadow herself who answered. That week, the team set up a temporary passage from her enclosure to the broader expanse of Havenwood's wildest range, acres of forest, streams, and untouched hills. The gate stood open for hours each day, a silent invitation. At first, Shadow paced at the threshold, uncertain. Rusty dashed ahead, circling back, calling for her with kittenish impatience. But Shadow hesitated, sniffing the air, listening for danger. It took days of trying, steps forward, sudden retreats, the old dance between longing and fear. Then, one evening as the sky glowed pink and gold, Shadow finally stepped through. She didn't run. She moved slowly, testing the earth beneath her paws, eyes wide but steady. Rusty bounded ahead, then doubled back to nudge her forward, his tail high with excitement. Aris watched, heart full, as the pair explored their new world. They could vanish into the trees if they wanted. But most nights, they returned to the clearing, by choice, not habit. They sought out the places that felt safe, places that held echoes of healing and kindness. In the parallel journey, Aris too felt something inside her shift. The old guilt that had haunted her, over the surgery that went wrong, over the lives she couldn't save, began to loosen. She hadn't mended Shadow with medicine, but with presence. And she realized that sometimes, Saving a life meant letting it belong to itself again. Elias, watching from the porch, found himself smiling more. There were still worries, still what-ifs. But there was also pride, a quiet, well-earned pride, in the world they'd built together, where freedom meant safety, and home wasn't a cage, but a choice, Joan. By the time autumn touched Havenwood with its first breath of cool air, Shadow and Rusty had become part of the landscape. Not pets, not captives, but family. Wild hearts that had learned in their own time what it meant to heal. Autumn at Havenwood is a quiet symphony, the crackle of dry leaves underfoot, the golden hush of afternoon, the soft calls of geese flying south. It's a time when everything seems to slow down, letting memories settle gently on the earth. It's in this softness that the deepest healing happens, though it's often invisible to anyone in a hurry. Shadow had always carried more than just the memory of steel bars. Her scars were invisible, stitched tight beneath her skin. But you could see, if you paid close attention, that something in her had changed. She no longer flinched at every snapping twig. Her movements, once tense and jagged, grew fluid, even playful. The world was still full of shadows, but now Shadow could move through them with her head held higher. Rusty was her bridge, a living symbol of innocence and new beginnings. He darted through the brush, chased grasshoppers, and returned to his mother with news of every adventure. Sometimes, when the evening sun poured gold over the rocks, Shadow would groom him. Her touch no longer rushed or anxious, but slow and steady, as if she was making up for all the comfort she'd once been too afraid to give. Aris kept coming, though she no longer needed to bring offerings or sit in silent vigil every day. She watched from a respectful distance, content just to see Shadow and Rusty thrive. Every so often, she'd leave a bowl of broth or a favorite toy by the clearing, but mostly, she offered them space, her greatest gift. She reflected on her own journey. She had come to Havenwood weighed down by regret, certain that her worth as a healer had ended with a mistake she could never undo. But she learned, watching Shadow, that healing didn't mean erasing the past. Instead, it meant layering new memories, moments of safety, patience, and choice over the old wounds, until the scars grew softer, less defining. The other staff noticed, too. Havenwood had always been a place for the broken and the wild, but now it felt like something more, a living promise that even the deepest pain could be met with gentle hands and open doors. Visitors were told Shadow's story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a celebration of resilience. People left the sanctuary changed, believing, if only for a moment, that love and patience could remake even the hardest heart. As the days grew shorter, Shadow and Rusty spent more time in the open, basking in the pale sunlight, playing and napping without fear. Sometimes, at dusk, Shadow would sit at the very edge of the woods, watching the sanctuary lights flicker on, her silhouette dark and proud against the fading sky. She was still wild. She would always be wild, but she belonged to herself now, not to her scars. The circle of sound was complete, from the shattering click of a camera shutter, to the quiet cadence of Aris's reading voice, to the peace that now lingered in the hush of autumn. Every echo of pain had been slowly transformed into an echo of hope. If you asked Aris what lesson she carried from all this, she'd tell you, true healing isn't about tearing down someone's walls, but waiting outside with a gentle flame, long enough, patiently enough, until they choose to open the door themselves. Time and freedom are the rarest gifts, and love is never about force. It's about presence. about being there. Day after day, even when no one is watching. As Havenwood settled in for the winter, Shadow and Rusty remained, a testament that given space and kindness, even the deepest darkness can fade. Their story is a reminder to all of us. Sometimes the best way to heal is not to push or pull, but to simply wait, to trust, and to love.